The folded papers landed on the table between them like a gunshot, and Kate Hadley's breath stopped completely. She stared at them. Her hands, which had been steady through every hard mile of the past 3 years, began to tremble. The lantern light caught the official wax seal on the edge of the top document, and she recognized it instantly, the seal of the Territorial Land Office, the same seal she had seen pressed into the corner of her father's letters. The letters she had read so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth along the creases. Alfred Trask stood across that narrow table in the back room of the Dry Creek Saloon, his dark hat in one hand, his jaw set like carved stone, and his eyes doing something she had never once seen them do in all the months she had known him. They were uncertain, almost afraid. "These were always rightfully yours," he said, and his voice, which she had heard deliver threats with the calm precision of a man counting bullets, broke slightly on the last word. Kate could not speak. She pressed both palms flat on the table and looked down at the papers and saw her father's name, Thomas Hadley, written in the careful legal script she would have known anywhere. Below it was the deed to the Hadley Ranch, 2,000 acres of prime grazing land in the Cimarron Valley, land that her Uncle Warren had told her had been legally transferred, sold to cover debts her father supposedly owed. Land she had been driven off of at 16 years old with nothing but a carpetbag and a lie. Her eyes moved up to Alfred. He was watching her with that particular stillness he had, the kind that looked like indifference from the outside but that she had learned, slowly and against her better judgment, to read differently. There was nothing indifferent about Alfred Trask. There never had been. "Where did you get these?" she whispered. He did not look away. "That's a long story. Tell it." And so he did. But to understand what Alfred Trask told her that night in the back room of the Dry Creek Saloon, you have to go back 8 months, to the October afternoon when Kate Hadley rode into the town of Millstone, New Mexico Territory, on a borrowed horse with $3.40 in her coat pocket and absolutely no plan whatsoever. It was 1882. And Millstone was the kind of town that the railroad had not quite reached yet, which meant it was still rough in the particular way of places that had not yet been forced to become respectable. The main street was unpaved, thick with the red dust that blew in off the mesa, and the buildings that lined it were a mixture of adobe and raw timber that told you exactly how recent and how uncertain the whole enterprise was. There was a bank, a general store, a land office, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, 2 saloons, and a jail that the current sheriff had built himself out of necessity after the previous structure burned down in an incident no one in Millstone seemed willing to discuss in detail. Kate had come to Millstone because it was the closest town to the Cimarron Valley, and the Cimarron Valley was where she intended to get her land back. She had been planning this for 3 years. Since the night her Uncle Warren had sat her down in the kitchen of the ranch house, the house where she had been born, and told her in his smooth, rehearsed voice that her father's death had revealed debts no one had known about, that the ranch had been attached by creditors, that he had done everything he could but there was simply nothing left for her, that she would need to go stay with her aunt in Santa Fe until she found a situation suitable for a young woman of her limited means. He had been so kind about it. So terribly, carefully kind. She had been 16 and grieving, and she had believed him. She was 22 now, and she knew better. She had spent 3 years in Santa Fe working as a seamstress, then as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant who had recognized that she was faster with numbers than any of his male clerks and had paid her accordingly, which was to say not equally but enough. She had saved. She had written letters to the Territorial Land Office and received careful, bureaucratic non-answers that told her nothing useful. She had written to lawyers and received quotes for services she could not afford. She had done research in the Territorial Library in Santa Fe, and she had found, buried in the public records, something her uncle had not expected anyone to look for. The deed transfer that had taken the Hadley Ranch out of her father's estate and put it in the name of a holding company called Cimarron Land Associates had been filed 3 weeks before her father's death. Not after, before. Thomas Hadley had not sold his land to cover debts. He had not transferred it under any kind of financial pressure. The paperwork had been filed while he was still alive, and the signature on it, the signature that was supposed to be his, had been witnessed by Warren Hadley himself. Kate had stared at that discovery for a long time, sitting in the cold reading room of the Santa Fe Library with her coat still on because they did not heat the building adequately, and she had felt something harden inside her that had nothing to do with coldness. It had to do with clarity, with the particular kind of resolve that comes when you stop being confused and start being certain. Her father had not run up debts. Her uncle had forged his signature. The ranch had been stolen. She arrived in Millstone with that certainty and with very little else, and she took a room at the boarding house run by a Mrs. Clara Drummond, who charged $3 a week, which meant Kate had approximately 4 days to figure out her next move before she was sleeping in the livery stable. She found work immediately at the general store because the owner, a heavyset man named Gideon Prout, needed someone who could do inventory without miscounting and make change without having to write the arithmetic on a paper first. Kate could do both in her sleep. She had the job within an hour of asking for it. She spent her first 2 weeks in Millstone learning the landscape of the place, which in a small western town meant learning who the people were and how they connected to each other. She learned that the sheriff was a man named Coles Barnett, who was honest but cautious, a man who moved carefully and preferred to avoid conflict where he could. She learned that the land office was run by a clerk named Douglas Fitch, who had held the position for 11 years and was reputed to know every land transaction in the Cimarron Valley going back to the territorial surveys. She learned that the Hadley Ranch, her ranch, was currently operated by a man named Vic Sutter, who had been installed as a manager by Cimarron Land Associates, and who was not, by any account she could gather, a pleasant individual. And she learned about Alfred Trask. Everyone in Millstone knew about Alfred Trask, the way everyone in a small town knows about the thing they are both afraid of and fascinated by. He was the leader of a small outfit that operated in the territory, not a large gang, not the kind that made territorial newspapers with dramatic headlines, but a tight group of 5 or 6 men who had been robbing Cimarron Land Associates supply wagons and payroll shipments for the better part of a year. The sheriff wanted him. The land company wanted him badly. The people of Millstone, many of whom had their own complicated feelings about Cimarron Land Associates, maintained a studied neutrality on the subject of Alfred Trask that Kate recognized as a kind of quiet sympathy expressed through deliberate silence. She first saw him on her 3rd week in Millstone. It was a Saturday afternoon, and she was sweeping the front boardwalk outside Prout's general store when a small group of riders came down the main street at an unhurried pace, which itself was noteworthy because men who needed to hurry did not usually walk their horses through the middle of town in broad daylight. There were 4 of them, and 3 of them she had never seen before, but the one in front she recognized from the description she had heard. Tall, lean, dark-coated, with a face that belonged on a man who had spent years looking at horizons. He pulled up in front of the general store. His eyes moved to her with the quick, assessing quality she was already learning was characteristic of him, the look of a man who made rapid calculations as a matter of survival. Then he dismounted in one easy motion and stepped up onto the boardwalk. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Afternoon," Kate said. She did not stop sweeping. He went inside. She swept. She was aware of him in the way you are aware of something that is simultaneously dangerous and interesting, which she had learned early in life was a combination that required careful handling. He came out 10 minutes later carrying a paper sack of supplies. He stepped onto the boardwalk and paused, and she knew without looking that he was watching her. "You're new," he said. "About 3 weeks," she said. "What brings you to Millstone?" She looked at him directly then, because she had decided early in her life that direct was better than evasive, and that the best way to handle a man who was accustomed to people being afraid of him was to simply not be afraid of him. "Business," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, something more controlled than that but in the same territory. "What kind of business?" "The kind that's mine," she said pleasantly. He was quiet for a moment, and she could not read what he was thinking, which was unusual for her. She was good at reading people. It was what had kept her employed and safe and moderately ahead of disaster for 3 years in Santa Fe. Alfred Trask was harder to read than most. "Alfred Trask," he said, and held out his hand. She looked at the hand. She knew she should not shake it. She shook it anyway. "Kate Hadley." His eyes changed when she said the name, just slightly, just enough that she noticed it. Then the expression smoothed back out and he said, "Good afternoon, Miss Hadley," touched the brim of his hat and walked back to his horse. She watched him ride away and thought about that brief change in his eyes, that flicker of something, recognition maybe, or its close cousin, and she thought about it for a long time afterward. That evening she asked Mrs. Drummond about Alfred Trask, framing it as simple curiosity, the natural interest of a newcomer hearing a name that seemed to carry weight. Mrs. Drummond, who was a woman of approximately 50 with sharp eyes and a talent for information, told her what she knew, which was more than most people's carefully maintained neutrality might have suggested. Alfred Trask had grown up in the territory. His father had been a small rancher in the Cimarron Valley, one of a dozen independent operators who had run cattle on land they had homesteaded or purchased at low prices in the years before the big land companies had moved in. About 4 years ago, Cimarron Land Associates had begun a systematic campaign of buying out, forcing out, and in some cases simply legally maneuvering around the small ranchers of the valley. Most of them had eventually sold or moved. A few had tried to fight through the courts and lost. Alfred Trask's father, a man named George Trask, had been one of the holdouts, and he had died of a fever 18 months ago, the ranch having been taken by the company through a legal process that, according to Mrs. Drummond, several people in Millstone believed was considerably less legitimate than it appeared on paper. Alfred Trask had been working cattle drives in Kansas when his father died. He had come back to find the ranch gone, and his father's grave on land he no longer had any right to visit. He had spent 6 months trying legal channels, the same brick walls Kate had encountered in Santa Fe. And then, somewhere in those 6 months, he had become the man who was now robbing Cimarron Land Associates wagons on the Mesa Road. Kate sat with this information for 3 days before she made a decision that she was fairly certain any reasonable person would describe as unwise. She decided to find Alfred Trask and tell him what she knew. The finding him part was not as difficult as it might have been, because she had spent 3 weeks in Millstone learning that the studied neutrality of the townspeople about Alfred Trask extended to a particular reluctance to go looking for him in the hills north of town, a reluctance that was itself a kind of signal. She rode north on her day off, which was Sunday, on the horse she had borrowed from Prute's stable on the understanding that she was going to look at the wildflowers on the mesa, which was not entirely untrue since there were wildflowers on the mesa. She had been riding for 2 hours when she became aware that she was being followed. She pulled her horse to a stop and turned around. One of the men from Alfred Trask's group was sitting on a horse about 30 yards back, watching her without any apparent concern. "You can tell him I want to talk," she said at normal conversational volume, because the air up there was clear and sound carried. The man did not respond. He turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. She waited. She had a canteen of water and 3 biscuits from Mrs. Drummond's kitchen, and the patience of a woman who had been working toward a goal for 3 years, so waiting did not trouble her. Alfred Trask appeared from the north about 40 minutes later, riding alone. He pulled up 10 feet away and looked at her with an expression that was thoughtful and not particularly surprised. "Miss Hadley," he said. "Mr. Trask," she said. I know what Cimarron Land Associates did to your family, and I know what they did to mine. I have evidence, legal evidence, that they forged my father's signature to steal the Hadley ranch. I've been trying to get it back for 3 years through legitimate means and getting nowhere. I'm wondering if you might be interested in a different approach." He was very still on his horse. The wind moved through the dry grass around them. A hawk traced a wide circle above the mesa. "What kind of different approach?" he said carefully. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I think we have information that might be useful to each other, and I think we have a common enemy." He studied her for a long time with those difficult-to-read eyes. She held his gaze because backing down from someone's scrutiny had never served her well. "You're Thomas Hadley's daughter," he said finally. "Yes. Your father was a good man. He helped my father once when we were boys, gave him the use of his grazing land during a drought year. Didn't charge him for it." He paused. "I was sorry when I heard he died." Something moved through her chest, warm and painful at once, the way it always did when someone who had actually known her father said something kind about him. She pressed it down into a manageable shape. "Thank you. What evidence do you have?" She told him about the deed transfer, the date, the signature, the witness line with Warren Hadley's name on it. She watched him take it in, watched him process it the way she was learning he processed things, quietly, thoroughly, without visible reaction until he had decided what the reaction should be. "That's not the kind of evidence that wins in a territorial court," he said. "Not against a company with Cimarron Land Associates money and connections." "I know," she said, "which is why I'm not sure what to do with it. But you came to me." "I came to you," she agreed. He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "Come on then," and turned his horse north, and after only the briefest hesitation she followed him. His camp was in a canyon about 4 miles north of where they had met, sheltered by red rock walls and a stand of pinon pine, with a spring at the far end that made it comfortable in a way that surprised her. The men there, she counted 5, regarded her with varying degrees of suspicion. Alfred Trask made no particular introduction, just told them to leave her alone and led her to a spot near the fire where they sat across from each other on flat rocks and talked for 3 hours. She learned things that afternoon that she had not known. Alfred Trask had been doing more than robbing wagons. He had been, with considerable patience and at considerable personal risk, gathering information. He had a copy of the original Articles of Incorporation for Cimarron Land Associates, obtained through means he did not specify, and the names on those articles were not the names of the men who publicly ran the company. The visible leadership was a man named Prescott, who had an office in Santa Fe and a veneer of legitimacy polished to a high shine. But the founding documents showed different names, including, buried in the middle, a name that Kate had not expected to see: Warren Hadley. Her uncle was not just the man who had delivered the lie that drove her off her land. He was one of the founders of the company that had stolen it. She sat with that for a very long time. Alfred watched her and did not say anything, which she found, in that moment, to be exactly the right thing. She did not need comfort or reassurance. She needed space to feel the full weight of it without someone trying to minimize it. "He told me he had tried to help me," she said at last. "He said he had fought the creditors, but there was nothing he could do." "I know," Alfred said. "He sat across from you and said that while his name was on the founding documents of the company that had just stolen your land, and then put me on a stage to Santa Fe." "Yes." She looked at the fire. The cold certainty she had been carrying for 3 years shifted and reconfigured itself into something sharper. Sharper and, paradoxically, cleaner. Because what she had known before was that a wrong had been done. What she knew now was the full architecture of the wrong, and there was something about completeness, even terrible completeness, that was easier to carry than a mystery. "What are you planning to do with all of this?" she asked. "That's something I've been working on," he said. "There's a federal land commissioner coming through the territory in the spring, a man named Hargrove." He's been appointed to investigate land grant irregularities in New Mexico territory, which is a polite way of saying that someone in Washington has finally noticed that a significant amount of land transfer in this territory has been accomplished through methods that don't bear close examination. Kate looked at him. You know about Commissioner Hargrove. I've been expecting him for 6 months, and you think if we can get our evidence to him before Cimarron Land Associates can discredit us, he might actually do something. I think it's the only legitimate path that has any real chance, Alfred said. The territorial courts are compromised. The land office clerk in Millstone, Fitch, is on their payroll, but a federal commissioner is outside their network. And if the evidence is strong enough and the testimony is credible enough, it becomes a federal matter, which means they lose their local advantages. Kate thought about this carefully. She thought about what strong enough evidence would look like, and what credible testimony would require, and what standing between here and the spring would be, practically speaking. What do you need from me? She asked. The deed document, he said. The original, not a copy, with the date and your uncle's name as witness. Combined with what I have on the founding documents, that's the core of the case. I only have copies, she said. The original is in the Santa Fe Territorial Record Office. Can you get it? She thought about the layout of the record office. She thought about the clerk who worked there, an older man named Phelps who had been sympathetic to her inquiries but who operated within the bureaucratic machinery of his position without deviation. She thought about what getting the original would mean, practically and legally. Not legally, she said. He met her eyes. No, he agreed. Not legally. There was a long pause. That's a significant ask, she said. Yes, he said simply. He did not pressure her. He did not make the argument for her, which she noticed and appreciated. Let me think about it, she said. She rode back to Millstone in the late afternoon with a great deal to think about, and over the next 2 weeks she thought about almost nothing else. She thought about the law, and how it was supposed to work, and how it actually worked, and how the gap between those two things was where most injustice lived. She thought about her father, who had been a man who believed in doing things right and who had been killed, she now suspected, not by any natural illness but by a situation engineered by a man he trusted. She thought about Alfred Trask, who was operating outside the law for reasons she found, the more she examined them, genuinely difficult to condemn. She thought about the look in his eyes when she had said her father's name, the recognition that had preceded everything else. She went back to the canyon on her next Sunday off, and she told him she would go to Santa Fe. What she did not tell him was that she was going to try the legal route one more time first, not because she thought it would work, but because she needed to be absolutely certain she had exhausted it before she crossed the line she was contemplating crossing. She wrote a formal letter to Commissioner Hargrove's advance office in Santa Fe, which she had found listed in the territorial newspaper, detailing her situation with as much specificity as she could without providing documentation. She received, 12 days later, a reply from a secretary indicating that the commissioner would be taking evidence in Santa Fe in late January, approximately 4 months away, and that she could present herself at that time. 4 months. She wrote back asking if there was any mechanism for obtaining the original documents from the Territorial Record Office through official channels given the circumstances. She received no reply. She went back to the canyon. Alfred listened to her account of the correspondence without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "January, that gives us time to do this right." "You mean enough time to go to Santa Fe and get the original document," she said. "Yes," he said. "But not just that. We need to make sure that what we bring to Hargrove is airtight, because Cimarron Land Associates is going to fight back the moment they realize what's happening, and they're going to fight with everything they have. If there's a single weak point in our case, they'll find it. What else do we need?" He reached into his coat and produced a carefully folded sheaf of papers. She took them and spent a long time going through them in the firelight, because they were complex and she was thorough. What they contained, she realized slowly, was remarkable. He had bank records, or rather copies of them, showing payments from Cimarron Land Associates to the Millstone Land Office clerk, Douglas Fitch, over a period of 3 years. He had a sworn statement, signed and dated, from a man named Joseph Carver, who had worked as a surveyor for the company and who had witnessed the falsification of survey records on 2 separate properties, the Trask Ranch being one of them. He had correspondence, somehow obtained, between Prescott and Warren Hadley discussing the management of the Valley properties in language that, while carefully worded, was damning when read alongside the official public record. "How did you get all of this?" she said. "Carefully," he said. "Over a long time. Some of it was dropped by accident, paperwork in wagons we stopped. Some of it was provided by people who were angry enough about what had been done to them to take a risk. The statement from Carver took me 6 months to get. He's living in Colorado now, but he was scared, and it took a long time to convince him that testifying was safer than staying silent." She looked up from the papers at him. In the firelight he was harder to read than ever, but there was something in the way he had just described that 6 months of patient work that told her more about him than anything she had heard from anyone else. This was not a man who had simply become an outlaw because the law had failed him. This was a man who had never stopped trying to build a legitimate case, even while using illegitimate means to survive. "You've been planning this for a long time," she said. "Since my father died," he said. "He spent the last year of his life trying to fight them and getting nowhere. I promised him I would finish it." She folded the papers back into their careful order and handed them to him, and for a moment their hands were both on the papers at once, and neither of them moved for just a second longer than was necessary before she let go. "All right," she said. "Let's go to Santa Fe." They left for Santa Fe in mid-November, which meant cold mornings and short days and nights that dropped below freezing on the high desert. Alfred brought 2 of his men, a quiet Mexican vaquero named Tomás who had ridden with him for 2 years, and a former cavalryman named Eli who was good with horses and better with firearms, and who had a quality of steady, unflappable usefulness that made him excellent company on a difficult road. Kate brought herself, and everything she had learned about traveling through hard country without complaint. She had told Prout at the general store that she had family business in Santa Fe and would be back within a month. She had told Mrs. Drummond the same thing. She had not told either of them who she was traveling with, because that was information that would have complicated things significantly. The road to Santa Fe was 5 days of hard riding, and they did it without incident, which surprised her a little because she had half expected Cimarron Land Associates to have people watching the roads. Either they did not, or Alfred knew how to avoid the roads that were being watched. She suspected the latter. She and Alfred rode side by side for most of those 5 days, and they talked. She had not, in her adult life, had many conversations like those. Conversations that moved freely between serious things and less serious things, between her father's death and the best way to light a fire in wet conditions, between the failures of the territorial court system and the particular quality of the cold desert light at 6 in the morning, between her years in Santa Fe and his years driving cattle in Kansas. He was, she discovered, not simply the careful, watchful man she had first taken him for, though he was certainly that. He was also, under the watchfulness, someone who had read more than she would have expected, who had opinions about things he had no practical reason to have opinions about, who could be quietly funny in a way that crept up on you, the kind of humor that required you to be paying attention to catch it. She was always paying attention. On the 3rd night, camped in a canyon out of the wind with Tomás and Eli sleeping on the far side of the fire, she and Alfred sat up later than they should have, and she told him about her father in a way she had not told anyone in 3 years, not just the facts of his death and what had been taken, but what he had been like when he was alive. The way he had gotten up before dawn every morning because he said the ranch spoke to you differently in those first blue minutes before the sun came up. The way he had taught her to ride and to read and to do accounts, because he said there was no reason a woman couldn't manage land as well as any man, and that a woman who could do her own accounts was a woman who couldn't be cheated. The irony of that last lesson was not lost on either of them, and she laughed about it, a real laugh, the first she had managed on the subject in years. Alfred listened to all of it with the quality of attention she was coming to think of as one of the most remarkable things about him. He did not interrupt. He did not redirect. He asked questions only when they were genuine, and when he asked them she felt the reality of her father come more alive in the telling, because the questions showed that he was actually seeing who Thomas Hadley had been, not just filing the information. When she finished, she asked about George Trask, and he told her. A rancher who had worked his land with his hands for 30 years, and who had built something from nothing, and who had watched it taken from him piece by piece through legal maneuvers, he didn't fully understand, but that he knew were wrong. A man who had gotten sick and died in the last months before he would have had to either fight or go, and Alfred had always thought, though he would never be able to prove it, that the stress of it had killed him as surely as any bullet. "I'm sorry," Kate said. "So am I," Alfred said. He was looking at the fire. Then he looked at her, and the firelight was in his eyes, and she felt something shift between them that she had been trying not to feel for weeks, because she was a practical woman who was on a specific mission with specific goals, and she could not afford complications. The feeling did not care about her practicality. She looked back at the fire, and they sat in a companionable quiet for a while longer, and then she went to sleep. Santa Fe in November was cold and gray and familiar in the way that places you have had a hard time in are familiar, not warm, but known. Kate had spent 3 years there, and she knew its streets and its social architecture well enough to navigate both efficiently. They took 2 rooms at a boarding house on the north side of town, Alfred and his men in one, Kate in the other, and spent the first day mapping out what they needed to do. The Territorial Record Office was on Palace Avenue, a low adobe building with a front office where you could request documents and a back room where the actual records were kept. Kate went in alone on the second day, wearing the respectable blue wool dress she had saved for professional occasions, and asked Clerk Phelps about the procedure for accessing original land grant documents for the purposes of legal review. Phelps was, as she remembered him, a thin man of middle age with reading glasses and a cautious, conscientious manner. He was also, she noted immediately, more nervous than he had been on her previous visits. He told her that requests for original documents had to go through a formal application process that took a minimum of 60 days. She asked whether there were any exceptions for federal proceedings. He said there were technically, but that they required a letter of authorization from the relevant federal office, which would require its own application process. She thanked him politely and left. That evening she told Alfred what she had found. He listened, and then he said, "The back room. How is it secured?" She described it as precisely as she could, the single window on the rear wall, the heavy filing cabinets, the locked wooden cabinet against the far wall where the oldest and most significant documents were kept. She had glimpsed all of this through the open door when Phelps had gone back to check on something for her 2 visits ago. "The lock on the wooden cabinet is the kind you can pick with the right tool," Alfred said. He was not asking her permission. He was telling her a fact. "Tomás is good at it." "We'd need about 20 minutes in the building. If we're caught," she said, "we lose everything. Any case we have is ruined." "If we're not caught," he said, "we have the original document." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The night watchman changes shift at midnight. The new man makes his rounds at 1:15 and then doesn't come back to the south side of the building for about 45 minutes. She had observed this over the 2 days since their arrival, the kind of observational thoroughness her father had taught her and her years in Santa Fe had refined. "The window on the back room faces the alley." Alfred looked at her. Something moved in his expression that was warm and a little startled, the look of a man who had underestimated someone he had been trying not to underestimate. "1:15 midnight, then," he said. She did not go into the building. That was the agreement, practical and not negotiated but understood. She stood in the alley with Eli, both of them very still and very quiet, while Alfred and Tamaz went through the window. She counted the minutes in her head. The cold was deep, and the alley smelled of horse and dust, and somewhere far off a dog was barking steadily at something. Alfred and Tamaz came back through the window at 19 minutes. Alfred had a flat leather case under his coat that had not been there before. They walked back to the boarding house at a pace designed to look like people going home from a late evening, not running, not loitering, just moving with purpose and calm. They did not speak until they were inside. In Alfred's room, with Tamaz keeping watch in the hallway and Eli at the window, Alfred opened the leather case on the table. Inside was a collection of documents. He went through them quickly, with the fingers of a man who knew what he was looking for, and then he stopped and put one on the table in front of her. The Hadley land grant deed. The original, with the date, the signature, the witness line. Her uncle's name written in his own hand 3 weeks before her father's death. She looked at it for a long time. "There's something else," Alfred said. He put another document on the table beside the first. It was a second deed, dated a week after the first. And on this one, the same land, the same description, the same parcel, her father's signature appeared again. A different signature, shakier, dated 8 days before his death. She looked up. 2 deeds, Alfred said. The first one transfers the land to Cimarron Land Associates. The second one, made 1 week later, transfers it back to you. He paused. Your father found out what your uncle had done. He created a correcting deed. He signed the land back to you. The room was very quiet. The company suppressed this, Kate said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her because everything in her chest was not. They had to. If this deed was ever found, the transfer to them is void. The land was never legally theirs. It went to you the moment your father died. She put both hands on the table. She looked at the 2 documents side by side. She thought about her father, who had been a man who believed in doing things right, who had discovered the betrayal of his brother, and who had not raged or threatened or gone for a gun, who had sat down and done the legal work that would protect his daughter, who had died, she now knew with certainty, before he could tell her, and whose enemy had then buried the document that would have given her everything. She did not cry. She had done her crying for her father 3 years ago in an empty room in Santa Fe, and she had finished it, or at least she had packed it away deeply enough that it was not available to her now. What she felt now was something different, something that felt very close to justice. These were always rightfully mine, she said, not to Alfred, just to the room, just to the air, just to the document on the table. Yes, Alfred said quietly. They were. She looked up at him, and he was close, closer than she had quite realized, because the table was narrow and they had both leaned over the documents together, and his eyes were doing the thing she had noticed in the Millstone saloon on the day she first saw him, that quality of genuine, unguarded attention that was so different from his usual careful watchfulness that it always caught her off guard. She straightened. He straightened. The moment reconfigured itself into something they both stepped back from, not because either of them wanted to, she suspected, but because there were important and dangerous things happening and neither of them was the kind of person who let feeling override function. We need to get these to Hargrove, she said. January, he said, 6 weeks. We can't stay in Santa Fe that long. They'll notice the documents are gone. No, he agreed. We go back to Millstone, we wait. When Hargrove's people announce his arrival date, we make the trip. She looked at him. And in the meantime, he said, we keep these very safe and we stay out of trouble. This turned out to be, like many plans, easier to state than to execute. They were 3 days out of Santa Fe on the road back to Millstone when Alfred's man Tamaz spotted the riders coming up behind them at a pace that was not casual. 2 men, well mounted, following at a distance that was just outside easy rifle range. Company, Tamaz said quietly. Alfred looked back without turning his head obviously, which was a trick Kate had been watching him employ and trying to understand the mechanics of. I see them, he said. They've been behind us since the last town. Someone at the record office, Kate said. Phelps, maybe, or one of the associates' men watching the building. He was calm about it, which helped her be calm about it. We're not going to outrun them. We need to make them pass us. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in patience and terrain management that Kate found herself admiring despite the circumstances. Alfred chose a road that went through a stretch of broken country where the canyon walls provided cover, and they moved off the road into the rock and mesquite, and waited in a stillness so complete that the 2 following riders, who passed at a trot less than 100 yards away, did not appear to see them at all. She held her horse's nose gently to keep him quiet and breathed slowly and watched the riders go by with her heart beating hard and her face absolutely still. When they were gone, Alfred exhaled and looked at her. "Good," he said simply. "I've had practice keeping quiet," she said. They made it back to Millstone without further incident, though Alfred changed their route twice more over the remaining 2 days in ways that added hours to the journey but kept them off the most traveled roads. Back in Millstone, Kate returned to her room at Mrs. Drummond's and her job at Pruitt's General Store, and Alfred returned to his canyon, and they were careful about how often they met because the circumstances had changed, and both of them knew it. The theft from the record office would have been discovered. The associates would be looking. It was not safe for Kate to be seen in Alfred's company, and it was not safe for Alfred to be seen in Millstone at all. They communicated through a system Alfred suggested that was both practical and slightly absurd, involving a loose stone in the wall of the old mission at the edge of town where notes could be left. Kate wrote to him about what she was hearing in town, which was useful because Gideon Pruitt's General Store was the kind of place where people talked, and she was the kind of person who people talked to more than they should because she had a quality of attentive, non-reactive listening that made them feel safe. She heard things about Vic Sutter at the Hadley Ranch, and about Douglas Fitch at the land office, and about a stranger who had come to Millstone asking questions about missing records in Santa Fe. She wrote all of this in careful, compressed notes and left them under the loose stone, and Alfred's replies appeared within a day or 2, also compressed, always informative, occasionally including a line that had nothing to do with practical matters, a brief observation about something she had mentioned, a question about something she had told him on the road, small things that were not necessary, but that she found herself reading twice. December moved through Millstone in its cold, dry way, and Kate continued her work at the store and her evenings at Mrs. Drummond's, where she read by the oil lamp and wrote letters, and did the accounting for her situation with the precision her father had taught her. She was building something, she knew, piece by piece, day by day, not just a legal case but something else that she could not yet name fully, something that had to do with Alfred Trask and what happened when 2 people with a common wound spent long hours talking in firelight and discovered that the wound was not all they had in common. She was 22 years old and she had been managing herself and her future without anyone's assistance for 3 years, and she was good at it, but she was finding, with a clarity that surprised her, that she did not want to manage it entirely alone anymore. Not in the abstract, not in the way of wanting company for its own sake. In the specific. She wanted Alfred Trask's company, specifically, and she was practical enough to acknowledge this to herself even while being cautious enough not to do anything precipitous about it. He came to Millstone once in December in the dark of a moonless night and tapped on her window at the boarding house like something from a novel she would have laughed at before she found herself living it. She had been awake because she rarely slept well, and she pulled on her coat and came to the window and looked at him in the dark. "I wanted to tell you directly," he said quietly. "I have word from Carver in Colorado. He's agreed to make the trip to testify in person before Hargrove." That's significant. A sworn statement is one thing, but a witness who can answer questions is much harder to discredit. "That's very good," she said. She was holding the window frame and looking at him in the dark, and the cold was on her face. "There's something else," he said. "Tell me." "I've been thinking about what happens after," he said. "After Hargrove, after the land is returned. You'll have the ranch if things go the way they should. What are you going to do with it?" She looked at him. The dark made his face harder to read than usual, which was saying something. "Run it," she said. "The way my father did. Cattle, probably, maybe horses." "That's a significant operation for one person," he said. "I managed a general store's inventory and accounts in my spare time," she said. "I think I can manage a cattle operation." "I don't doubt it," he said. There was a pause that had a particular texture. "I meant that you might want help." She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of help?" "The kind," he said carefully, "that a man might offer if he had been thinking about it for several months and had decided that offering it openly was better than not offering it, even at the risk of being told no." Kate looked at him in the dark for a long time. The cold was significant, but she had stopped feeling it some minutes ago. "You're offering to help me run the ranch," she said. "I'm offering considerably more than that," he said. "The ranch is part of it, but it's not the part I'm most interested in talking about." She leaned against the window frame. "Alfred Trask," she said, "are you courting me through a boarding house window in December?" Something moved in his face that the dark softened but could not quite hide. "I appear to be," he said. "I'm aware it's not the most conventional approach." "You're an outlaw," she said. "I broke into a government records office. I don't think we have much standing to insist on convention." "No," he said. He was very still. "Is that a yes?" "It's not a no," she said. "It's a considerable amount of yes with some very legitimate practical concerns attached to it." "Such as?" "Such as the fact that you are currently a wanted man in 2 counties," she said, "and the plan is to hand yourself over to a federal commissioner in January." "The plan is to testify before a federal commissioner," he said. "There's a difference. Hargrove's mandate specifically includes the authority to offer immunity to witnesses whose testimony serves the federal interest in cases of land fraud. My lawyer in Albuquerque has confirmed this." She had not known about the lawyer in Albuquerque. She processed this. "You've been planning for your own legal situation as well." "I've been planning for a future that doesn't require me to live in a canyon," he said, "for a while now." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "Go back to your camp before someone sees you. We'll talk about the rest of it after January." "After January," he agreed. He touched his hat brim and stepped back into the dark, and she watched him until she couldn't see him any more, and then she closed the window and stood in her room in the cold with a complicated and genuine happiness moving through her, something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it properly. January came cold and clear. Commissioner Hargrove arrived in Santa Fe on the 10th of the month and announced that he would begin taking evidence on the 15th. Alfred arrived at Mrs. Drummond's boarding house on the morning of the 12th with Tamaz and Eli, and a horse saddled for Kate, and she was ready because she had been ready since October, since she was 16, since she stood in the kitchen of the ranch house and listened to a lie and was too young and too broken by grief to see it for what it was. They rode to Santa Fe in 3 days. Joseph Carver was already there, having come down from Colorado the previous week, a heavy-set, nervous man in his 50s who shook Alfred's hand and Kate's hand and who, when they sat together in the room Alfred had rented and went through the evidence, grew quieter and more serious as the full picture assembled itself. "I should have come forward years ago," Carver said at one point. "You're here now," Kate said. "That's what matters." The hearing before Commissioner Hargrove was not a dramatic affair in the way that dime novels would have made it. It was a formal proceeding in a government office, with a stenographer and 2 attorneys representing federal interests and a table around which several people sat and spoke in careful, measured language. Kate sat across from Hargrove, a methodical man of 60 with a northeastern accent and the manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where documents were more powerful than guns, and she told him everything. She told him about her father's death and her uncle's lie. She showed him the 2 deeds, the fraudulent transfer and the correcting deed her father had made, the one Warren Hadley's company had suppressed. She showed him the founding documents of Cimarron Land Associates with her uncle's name. She showed him the bank records of payments to Douglas Fitch. She introduced Alfred, who spoke about the broader pattern of land fraud in the valley, and presented the evidence he had gathered, including the affidavit that had started it all about the forged survey records. And she sat beside Joseph Carver while he described, in the careful, specific language of a professional surveyor, exactly how he had been instructed to falsify records and who had given those instructions. Hargrove asked questions for 4 hours. He was thorough and unhurried and very good at identifying weaknesses in testimony, which meant Kate had to be precise in a way that was demanding. But she had been living with these documents for months, and she knew them better than the people who had created them. At the end of the session, Hargrove set down his pen and looked at the collection of evidence on the table. "This is a significant case," he said. He was not speaking to anyone in particular, just to the room. "There will be a federal investigation into Cimarron Land Associates. I cannot tell you today what the outcome of that investigation will be, but I can tell you that the correcting deed your father created has legal validity, and that the suppression of it constitutes fraud. I am issuing an immediate order freezing the assets of Cimarron Land Associates pending investigation." He looked at Kate. "The Hadley Ranch title should be restored to you within 60 days pending the resolution of the freeze and the legal proceedings against the company." Kate nodded. Her hands were very still in her lap. Hargrove looked at Alfred. "Mr. Trask, the immunity provision I'm able to apply here is conditional on your testimony and your cooperation with the federal investigation going forward, which I understand you've agreed to. Is that still your position?" "Yes," Alfred said. "Then we have an arrangement." Hargrove made a note. "The activities you engaged in with regard to the land company's shipments will not be the subject of federal prosecution. I would strongly recommend, however, that you resolve any outstanding warrants at the county level through the proper channels. My office can provide documentation that may assist with that process." Alfred nodded. "Thank you." Outside the federal office on the cold Santa Fe street, Kate and Alfred stood side by side for a moment. Tamaz and Eli were at the horses. Carver had gone to arrange his return journey to Colorado. The street was busy with the ordinary motion of a territorial capital in January, wagons and horses and people moving with purpose against the cold. 60 days, Kate said. "About that," Alfred said. "Your warrants." "Sheriff Barnett in Millstone is a reasonable man," Alfred said. "I think with Hargrove's documentation and the end of the associates as a political force in the county, the conversation will go differently than it would have before today." She looked at him. He looked at her. The cold air between them was very still. "Alfred," she said. "Kate," he said. "The considerable amount of yes I mentioned in December," she said. "That's still my position." The thing that happened to his face was the most unguarded expression she had ever seen from him. It was not a smile exactly, or not only a smile. It was something that had been kept carefully behind the watchfulness and the competence and the patience, and that was now, for one moment, fully visible. Relief, maybe. Certainty. The expression of a man who had been working toward something for a long time and had just found out it was real. He reached over and took her hand, right there on the Santa Fe street, which was a gesture that was quiet and deliberate and not dramatic, just true. And she let him hold it, and they stood like that for a moment in the January cold, with everything changing around them in ways they were only beginning to understand. They rode back to Millstone, and Alfred went to see Sheriff Barnett, who was indeed a reasonable man and who, faced with Hargrove's documentation and the broader collapse of Cimarron Land Associates' influence in the county, agreed to a process by which the outstanding warrants would be resolved through a formal legal proceeding rather than a cell, conditional on Alfred's continued cooperation with the federal investigation. It took 3 weeks and the services of Alfred's lawyer in Albuquerque, but it was resolved. Warren Hadley was arrested in Santa Fe in February, along with Prescott and two other founding members of Cimarron Land Associates. Douglas Fitch at the Millstone Land Office resigned his position before federal investigators could formally charge him and left town, which was, several people agreed, a cowardly but efficient solution for everyone. Vic Sutter, the manager who had been running the Hadley Ranch, was removed from the property by the county sheriff in March. Kate received the formal documentation of the restored Hadley land title on the 15th of March, 1883, a cold, bright morning with the smell of coming spring in the air, and she sat at the table in Mrs. Drummond's boarding house and read her father's name on the document and her own name below it, and she allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not the long, exhausted grief of the years after his death, but something cleaner and shorter, the particular tears that come when a wrong has been put right, when something that was broken has been repaired. She cried for about 10 minutes and then she dried her eyes and made a list of what needed to be done. Alfred found her making the list. He knocked on Mrs. Drummond's door, which was the first time he had come to the house by the front door rather than the window, and when Mrs. Drummond let him in with a look that suggested she had her own list of observations about his visits, Kate came out of her room and found him standing in the front parlor turning his hat in his hands. "I heard," he said when he saw her face. "It came through this morning," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the open expression she was now getting more of, the expression that had been behind the watchfulness all along. "How are you?" "I cried for 10 minutes," she said. "And now I have a list." She showed it to him. He looked at the list. It was detailed and thorough, and included everything from structural assessments of the ranch buildings to cattle pricing in the territory to the legal process for establishing a permanent operating title. He read it with the attention he gave to everything, and when he finished he looked up and his eyes were doing that warm, slightly startled thing. "You've been ready for this for a long time," he said. 3 years, she said, "and a few months." He put the list on the table and looked at her with a directness that was deliberate and unhurried, the kind of look that requires you to either meet it or look away. She met it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask." "I'm not a wanted man anymore," he said. "Or I won't be formally once the proceedings are complete. I have some money saved. Not a great deal, but some. I know cattle and land and horses and how to build things that need to be built." He paused. "And I know that you are more than capable of doing this alone, and that you don't need me for any practical reason. And I want to be completely clear that what I'm asking has nothing to do with practical reasons." Kate looked at him steadily. Her heart was doing something it had been doing for months and that she had been managing with characteristic efficiency, but that she was now in this moment choosing not to manage. "Alfred Trask," she said, "are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes," he said simply, "I am." She was quiet for a moment that was not uncertain but was full, the way a moment can be full of more than just itself, full of everything that has led to it. "Yes," she said, "I am also saying yes." He crossed the parlor to her in 2 steps and took both her hands, and this time she stepped toward him instead of holding still, and when he kissed her it was not tentative or cautious. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been patient for a very long time and who had, finally, reached the end of the patience. Mrs. Drummond appeared in the doorway a moment later and then disappeared again with an expression of dignified satisfaction, which was, Kate thought, exactly right. They were married in April, in the church that doubled as a schoolhouse, with Tamaz and Eli as witnesses, and Mrs. Drummond in her best dress and Sheriff Barnett present, in a professional capacity that seemed to include a genuine personal warmth for the occasion. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through Millstone every month, and who married them with the practical efficiency of a man who had married many couples in his circuit, but with a sincerity that felt genuine. Kate wore the blue wool dress that she had worn to the record office, which was the best thing she owned, and Alfred wore a clean white shirt and a jacket she had not seen before, and looked as though he had been waiting for this day with the same patience he brought to everything important. After the ceremony, there was a meal at the Dry Creek Saloon, because the Dry Creek had the largest interior space available, and Mrs. Drummond had organized the preparation with considerable authority, and most of Millstone came through at some point during the afternoon, because in a small town, a wedding is a community event whether or not it is intended to be. And Alfred Trask was, whatever the complications of his recent past, someone the town had a complicated affection for, and Kate Hadley was someone who had been quietly winning friends at Pruitt's General Store for 6 months. They rode out to the ranch the next morning. It was a bright April day with the grass starting to come in and the cottonwoods along the creek showing their first green, and Kate pulled her horse to a stop on the ridge that she had stood on 100 times as a girl, and looked down at the valley and the low white buildings of the homestead and the creek running silver in the morning light, and felt something so large move through her that she could not contain it and did not try to. Alfred stopped beside her. He did not speak. He looked at the valley and then he looked at her face, and whatever he saw there, he reached over and put his hand briefly on hers and then let her have the moment entirely, which was exactly the right thing to do and which was, she was coming to understand, characteristic of him. The ranch was in a condition that required work. Vic Sutter had been running it as a commercial operation focused on immediate return, which meant some things had been deferred, and some things had been done badly, and a few things had been done not at all. Kate assessed it with the thoroughness she brought to all assessments and wrote a second list, longer than the first. Alfred assessed it with the eyes of a man who knew land and buildings and cattle, and made his own contributions to the list, including several things she had noticed but had not articulated, and several things she had not noticed at all. They worked on it together through the spring and into the summer, and working together on a physical thing turned out to be its own kind of intimacy, the kind that builds not through romantic gestures but through shared effort and the gradual, reliable discovery that two people's approaches to problems are genuinely compatible. Kate had been afraid, somewhere under her certainty, that the particular independence she had built over 3 hard years might chafe against someone else's presence in her work. It did not. Alfred worked alongside her without trying to lead everything or take things from her hands or make decisions she hadn't asked him to make, and she found that she could lean on his judgment when it was useful without feeling that she was losing any part of herself. Tamaz came to work on the ranch that spring, which suited everyone. He was good with horses and cattle and fencing, and he had a quiet dignity that fit the place. His wife, a practical and cheerful woman named Rosaria who had been waiting in Albuquerque for the legal situation to resolve, came in June, and her arrival made the ranch feel more complete, more like a working community than a project. Eli had gone north to Colorado after the hearing, drawn by some personal business he had been deferring. He wrote occasionally brief, factual letters that reported on his circumstances without sentiment. Alfred always wrote back. Kate wrote to Commissioner Hargrove's office in the summer to provide an update on the restoration of the land, and received a formal acknowledgement and a personal note from Hargrove himself indicating that the federal investigation into Cimarron Land Associates had been completed, and that the company had been dissolved, its assets dispersed through court proceedings to compensate, where possible, the individuals who had been defrauded. It was not a perfect outcome. Not every loss could be made whole, but it was real and it was legal and it was final. Warren Hadley was convicted in territorial court in October of 1883 of land fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 7 years. Kate read the newspaper account of the conviction in the ranch house kitchen on a Tuesday morning while Alfred was out checking the south fence line, and she sat with it for a long time. She had thought she would feel triumph. She felt something quieter than that, something more like the end of a long effort, the settling of a weight that had been carried so long it had started to feel like part of you. When Alfred came back in for the midday meal, He saw her face and put his hat on the peg, and came to sit across from her at the kitchen table, the same table at which they had learned to eat meals together, to talk through the day's problems and plans over coffee in the mornings, and over whatever they had managed to cook in the evenings, which improved considerably once Rosaria gave Kate a series of practical cooking lessons that Kate received with more gratitude than she would have expected. Having always been competent in the kitchen but not truly skilled, the verdict came through, she said. I heard it in town this morning, he said. I wasn't sure when to tell you. I'm glad it's done, she said, and then because she was a woman who believed in being honest about difficult things, I feel sorry for him a little, under everything. He was my father's brother. Alfred was quiet for a moment. That's not a small thing, he said, feeling that after everything he did. My father would have felt it, she said. I think I'm my father's daughter in that way. Alfred reached across the table and took her hand, and she held on. The fall of 1883 was good on the Cimarron Valley Ranch, which Kate had officially re-registered under its original name, the Hadley Spread, though she had also, quietly and without making any formal thing of it, added Trask to the registration in the way that felt right and permanent. The grass had come in well after the spring rains, and the small cattle operation they had started with was doing better than projected. The horses Alfred had brought, 3 good quarter horses from a breeder he knew in Texas, were settling into the valley as though they had been born to it. By December, Kate knew she was expecting a child. She told Alfred on a cold evening by the fire, directly and without preamble, because she had never developed a capacity for indirect communication, and the expression that came over his face was so completely open and unguarded that it was almost startling, the way things are startling when they are completely genuine. He came around the chair and crouched in front of her and took both her hands and looked at her with everything fully visible, the joy and the responsibility and the wonder of it, and he said, "Are you all right?" "Very well," she said. "Slightly nauseated in the mornings, but otherwise entirely well." He laughed, a real laugh, and kissed her hands and then her face, and she put her arms around his neck, and they stayed like that by the fire for a long time. Their son was born in the summer of 1884, a loud and healthy boy whom they named Thomas Alfred Trask, Thomas for the grandfather who had believed his daughter deserved everything and had made sure she could have it, Alfred for the man who had made sure she knew it. The birth was attended by the doctor who made the circuit through the Cimarron Valley and by Rosaria, who had experience and calm, and who managed the whole affair with the brisk competence of someone who knows what they are doing, which was a considerable comfort. Alfred spent the hours of the labor alternating between being entirely steady and very quietly falling apart, a combination that Kate found, in retrospect, deeply endearing. When they placed the baby in his arms for the first time, Alfred went very still in the way he went still when something was so significant that his usual efficiency of motion simply stopped. He looked at his son for a long moment, and then he looked at Kate, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life, the complete collapse of every guarded thing, the full reality of a man who had lost his family's land and spent years in canyons, and ridden the wrong side of the law through the broken country of the territory, and who was now, in this room, in this valley, holding his son, holding the evidence that the future was real and good and his. "Thomas," he said quietly, trying the name. "Thomas," Kate agreed. The baby made a small, decisive sound. Alfred looked up and his eyes were bright and he did not try to hide it. "He sounds like he has opinions already," he said. "He comes by that honestly," Kate said. Thomas Alfred Trask grew up on the Cimarron Valley Ranch in the particular freedom of a child on a working spread, which meant that he learned to ride before he learned to write and learned to read very shortly after, because both his parents treated literacy as a non-negotiable accomplishment, and his mother taught him from the same principles her father had taught her, that knowledge was its own kind of land, that no one could take it from you once you had it. In the spring of 1886, Kate had a second child, a daughter they named Alina, for no one in particular, but because the name seemed to suit the serious, watchful baby she turned out to be from her first days, a child who observed everything around her with an expression that Alfred said looked remarkably like her mother's professional listening face. Kate laughed at that every time. The ranch was, by 1887, something her father would have recognized and approved of. The cattle operation was steady and respected in the valley. The horses Alfred bred were developing a reputation in the territory for quality and soundness. Tamaz had built a proper bunkhouse that made the whole spread look more permanent and established, which it was. Rosaria's kitchen garden was extensive and productive. Mrs. Drummond had come to visit twice and had declared on her second visit that she considered the whole enterprise a credit to human perseverance. Alfred had been appointed to the Millstone Town Council in the spring of 1886, which was a development that amused Kate considerably, and that Alfred regarded with the characteristic mixture of seriousness and dry humor he brought to most things. He served on the council with the same patient thoroughness he had always brought to everything, and he was, she heard from various sources, very good at it, which surprised no one who actually knew him. Kate, for her part, had begun working with a group of other women in the valley and in Millstone who were organizing around issues of land rights and legal access, because her experience had given her both the knowledge and the motivation to help others navigate the system she had had to fight so hard to understand. She wrote 2 pieces for the territorial newspaper about the mechanics of land grant fraud in New Mexico Territory, under her own name, that generated more correspondence than she had expected, and a letter from a woman in Taos who had a situation remarkably similar to her own, which led to a months-long correspondence, and eventually a successful resolution for that woman that Kate considered one of the most satisfying things she had accomplished. One evening, in the fall of 1887, she and Alfred sat on the front porch of the ranch house, which Alfred had rebuilt and extended that summer with the help of Tamaz and a carpenter from Millstone, watching the last of the sunset over the Cimarron Valley. Thomas was inside with Rosaria, engaged in some project involving a large quantity of mud that had been deemed better executed indoors for reasons Kate had decided not to inquire into. Alina was asleep in the cradle that Alfred had made himself over the winter, a piece of work he had spent 4 months on, and that was considerably more beautiful than it needed to be. The valley was golden in the late light, the grass moving in the small evening wind, the creek visible as a dark line through the cottonwoods. Kate looked at it and felt the particular deep satisfaction that is different from happiness, wider than happiness, the satisfaction of something that is right and that has been built carefully out of the right materials over time. Alfred was leaning back in his chair with his legs stretched out and a coffee cup in his hand, and the ease of a man who was at home, genuinely and completely at home, in a way she did not think he had been anywhere for a very long time. "My father used to sit out in the evenings like this," she said. "He said the valley looked different at this hour than at any other, like it was showing you what it really was." Alfred looked at the valley. "He was right," he said. She looked at Alfred. He was 31 years old, and the years and the weather of the territory were in his face in the ways she had come to know as well as her own, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun, the way the lean angles of his face had settled into something that was not harder but more defined. He was more himself than she had ever seen him, which made sense, because this was the life he had been trying to build toward through all the years of canyons and wrong side of the law and patient gathering of evidence, this specific and real thing. He turned and found her looking at him, and his expression did what it did, the thing she still was not tired of, the opening. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "You." He reached over and took her hand the way he always did, with the same quiet deliberateness of the first time on the Santa Fe Street, and held it. "I've been thinking," he said. "About the Carver family," he said. Joseph Carver's daughter wrote to him about a land situation in Colorado that sounds familiar. I think I know someone who might be able to help. He glanced at her. Someone who has some experience with this sort of thing. Kate looked at him. Are you volunteering me? I'm asking, he said. There's a difference. She smiled. Write to her, she said. Tell her to write to me. He nodded, satisfied. They sat quietly for a moment, the valley settling into its evening colors around them. Alfred, she said. Yes. I want to tell you something, she said. Then tell me. There are moments, she said carefully, because she was always careful with the things that mattered most, when I am aware of everything that had to happen for this to be real, all of it, the hard parts too, and I think that a different version of things without the hard parts probably doesn't get here, to this. She gestured at the valley, at the house, at him. And I'm not glad about the hard parts, but I'm glad about this. Alfred was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the valley, and then he looked at her with all of it visible, the gratitude and the depth of it and everything he was. So am I, he said. Every day. The sunset moved over the Cimarron Valley, and the evening came in slowly, and they stayed on the porch until the stars were fully out, which in that country at that altitude was a sky full of brightness that she had loved since childhood and that she was glad to love again, from this porch in this life, with this man beside her. Inside, Thomas had apparently finished his mud project and was now loudly describing it to Rosaria, whose responses, audible through the open window, had the tone of someone being both patient and immensely entertained. Eleanor slept. The horses were quiet in the pasture. The creek moved in its old channel through the cottonwoods. Kate Hadley Trask sat in the evening air on the porch of her father's ranch, which was also her ranch, which was also her home, and she held her husband's hand and looked at the valley her father had loved, and that she had fought to come back to, and that she was now going to spend the rest of her life building into something worth leaving in time, to Thomas and Eleanor and whoever else might come along, which, considering the evidence so far, was not unlikely. She thought about the night in the Dry Creek saloon when Alfred had laid those documents on the table in front of her and said those words. These were always rightfully yours. She thought about what that moment had contained, not just the legal truth of it, the restored deed and the suppressed transfer, and the correction her father had made in the last week of his life, but the larger truth Alfred had also been offering without saying it directly. That she was someone who deserved what was hers, that her father had believed it enough to act on it, that Alfred believed it enough to have spent months and years working toward the moment when she could have it back. She thought about her father's handwriting on the correcting deed, careful and a little shaky, the handwriting of a man who knew he was running out of time and was doing the most important thing he could with what he had left. She thought about Alfred Trask, who had been a boy in this valley and who had come back to it as a man and who had stayed, through all the difficulty of staying until it was right. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The stars were fully out now over the Cimarron Valley, the same stars that had been over this land since long before anyone had put a name on it, or a fence around it, or a price on the deed. The same stars her father had shown her from this exact slope on summer evenings when she was a child, telling her the names of the constellations and the Comanche names for the same shapes and the practical uses of starlight for navigation, because he had believed in giving her all of it, everything he knew. Everything he thought she might need, which had turned out to be everything. She had needed all of it. She had found her way back. And the valley in the full dark of the October evening was everything her father had said it was, everything she had fought 3 years and ridden hard miles and crossed lines and built a case and stood before a commissioner and come home to find. It was hers. It had always been hers. And now, at last, it was also something more than hers. It was theirs, and it was full of life, and it was going to go forward. Alfred poured the last of the coffee and handed her the second cup and leaned back in his chair and looked up at the stars with the ease of a man who had, finally and completely, come home. The lamp in the window threw its warm light out onto the porch in the dark beyond it, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek An owl was calling in the way owls call in the Cimarron Valley in October, a sound she had heard all her life, a sound that meant home more than any other, and she let it settle over her like the gift it was. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was home.